Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're going to talk about housing tonight, which has got to be the number one topic, other than maybe Donald Trump, around coffee tables and dinner tables, et cetera, in Canada today, with Aled Iorwerth, who is the Deputy Chief Economist at the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. I've had the privilege of chatting with him before, and sir, you've been very active on social media and in the media lately, talking about housing. You've been talking about NIMBYism. You've been talking about productivity. You've been talking about interest rates. You've been talking about innovation. You've even been talking about how people don't move to jobs because of the high cost of housing. And you've just talked about whether we could actually build affordable housing anymore in Canada. So, this is going to be a great conversation to put the housing crisis that we're in perspective. So thank you very much, sir, for joining us. So let's start out with, what's going on. Interest rates are down. People thought that that would spur more development, but at the same time, it would appear, particularly in the Greater Toronto area, that condo sales are way down, are just not happening. There's something like 20,000 or more units of pre-construction condos that have now been completed and are on the market for resale and are just not selling, and the inventory is huge. Sales are not happening. I saw a statistic that listings are up like over 100%. If interest rates are down so much, and it was affordable in the past, and it's now more affordable, why aren't people buying up these homes?
That's a question that we're pondering as well. Our overall view is that we have a lagged effect of interest rates. Um, the bump in interest rates that we've experienced over the last couple of years has had quite a lot of changes. Investors are now quite reluctant, I think, to get into the home ownership, and that is people who buy those units and then rent them out. They're quite reluctant to come in. Rents are edging down, shall we say. They're not as strong as they used to be. So, and then we have this global uncertainty over what's going to happen with trade, whether that will have an economic impact on Canada or well, it will have an economic impact. I guess the question is how large that impact is. So with all of this uncertainty, the economy not strong, rents edging down, interest rates not clear where they're going, a lot of uncertainty. I think the incentive for a lot of people is just to stay on the sidelines. And so there were a lot, as you said, there were a lot of buildings that were started around 2021, 2020 during the pandemic. There were lots of delays getting those built because of various supply chain issues. All of these are now coming onto the market. Prices are down a little bit, so there's a lot of noise about whether condos will close, and so I think that, trying to summarize all of that, there's going to be a lot of noise in 2025. It's going to be a very difficult year to call, macro, micro. There's a lot of uncertainty.
The deliveries, and you hopefully have far better numbers than that I have, but I've been told that there was something like 26,000 condo deliveries in the Greater Toronto Area in 2024, and there's going to be like 10,000 more, 36,000 in 2025, and so therefore this current situation could actually get worse.
In the short term, yes. So what we're expecting is that a lot of those condos will come onto the market. It will suppress condo prices. It's unclear whether investors will step up because maybe they won't be able to rent those units out. Now, so yes, the situation will be challenging 25 into 26, but then there is a flip side to that because these investors are also very important to providing funding for new construction of condos, and that is completely dried up. So it is very likely that the new construction of condos is also going to fall through the floor in Toronto, in Vancouver. And so within a few years, we're going to be back with not enough supplies. This may correct in a few years, but the short term does not augur well for condos in Toronto.
There was, a raft of articles and then posts about blanket appraisals in the past 2 weeks. And the story was that some of these people that had condos that were being delivered couldn't close because, or didn't close because the values of those condos had declined by 30, 40%. But if they accepted a blanket appraisal provided by a bank that was financing lots of condos within the condominium, they could get an appraisal that would be equal to the original purchase price and would close. And then the question would be, how would the bank, financial regulators, and CMHC accept these blanket appraisals that were 40, 50% higher than a one-off appraisal on just that condo based on the resale value of those units? And so I got to ask you, what is that situation? Do you support these blanket appraisals? Does CMHC support these blanket appraisals? I guess what it does is it gives some stability to the marketplace and allows people to close on these condos. And if you're right that we're going to have a supply imbalance in a couple of years, maybe that's a good bet. But based on current valuations, it would appear to be a bad bet, and that these banks are really have losses on their balance sheets that they haven't recognized.
Yeah, I think that's a fair observation overall, and that's why we are closely monitoring the situation in Toronto. And it seems to be Toronto specific. Bit of concerns about Vancouver, but it does seem to be very specific to condos in Toronto. But the concern that you raise is completely legitimate, and not to pass the buck, but I think it's an issue for OSFI to look into. A lot of these condos are now going to be in excess of what CMHC, like CMHC used to have a $1 million cap, now 1.2. But I think it's a broad, so CMHC is not particularly active in the Toronto condo market. But I think it's an area that we have to continue to monitor very closely. At the moment, we're not seeing arrears and delinquencies go up at the moment, but we are monitoring the situation closely. So, but to come back to your question about blanket appraisals, I think that, and that's why I mentioned a lot of noise this year. There's a lot of issues about whether condos are going to close, whether people are going to try and walk away from their deposits. There's just a lot of uncertain. Will other builders step in to buy these condos? So there's that large building on is it Bloor and Young? Yeah, Bloor and Young. That's in trouble. Another developer stepped in to finish it. So I think there's a lot of noise going to be in condos. But like I said, in the flip sides, the starts are also falling quite sharply.
Is this just a condo problem, or could it spread to single family homes, to townhomes, to semis, etc.?
It potentially could. The Toronto people don't usually switch too often from these apartments into single detached because there's so much of a price difference, and there's not that many these days of new single detached being built. But the concern is that the potential is there for spreading of this issue. So condo prices going down. Will that lead to spillover? It's a possibility. It's a risk. At the moment, it's too early to tell. Like I said, the flip side is that this could correct itself in a year or two. So if condo prices came down a lot, we're in a structure, if you're looking over a 5-10 year horizon, we have a shortage of supply. So if condo prices came down a lot, it's possible that investors will step in and buy for the long term. So there are equilibrating forces, I guess. So it's too early to call at the moment, but I think we need to monitor the situation very closely.
So real estate agents are staying positive because they're saying that even though listings are up dramatically, prices are not down. Prices, I think the most recent price number I saw was a 1.7% increase. But then someone pointed out to me the problem is listings are for homes that haven't sold, and prices are for homes that have sold. And so therefore, what you don't know is what the price decline is for houses that are on the market. And I'm seeing, and I think lots of people are seeing better price, reduced price, improved price ads constantly in the marketplace, which would suggest that sellers are having to lower prices in single family homes as well if they actually want to sell. And the problem with the the sale price statistic is it's in the rearview mirror. It's for those homes that were successful and sold. Where do you think prices are going to go?
Well, I mean, in your list of issues, the one part that you didn't mention was the whole macroeconomic situation and what's going to happen with tariffs, which is going to lead to a whole other set of issues. So at the moment, it's a bit of a wild card calling for 2025. Now, if we abstract from the tariff issues, my sense is that prices will probably go down this year. But then interest rates will also come down. So within a year or two, the possibility is they're rebounding again. 2025 looks like it's going to be a very hard year to call, a very rough year potentially. But like I said, within 2 or 3 years, this may all bounce back.
That's interesting. So this year's going to be a challenge, but don't worry, long term, we're going to be okay.
I wouldn't say don't worry, because if we don't get the supply right now, prices, risk going up again sharply in a year or two, and then we're back to an affordability problem, and that leads to another set of problems.
So
This,
if so the increase in supply and the decrease in prices is exactly what we want, is what you're saying.
yes, but it needs to be sustained over a long term. The concern at the moment is that we're having a sort of an excess supply right at this moment in time, and it's going to totally discourage new supply that we need longer term. So this is the trade-off.
So it's a bust boom kind of
Yes,
situation.
exactly. And that's what people have noticed that when you have these cities like Toronto, like Vancouver, that have structural shortage of supply, they tend to be much more bust boom than other places. So San Francisco, LA, New York, these are all characterized by boom and bust cycles, whereas you tend to get more even growth in other places.
Well, that's got to be the solution. Maybe we can take a break and come back and figure out how we get to that solution. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes, we're talking about the housing crisis in Canada, Southern Ontario, and particularly the GTA. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're talking housing tonight with the Deputy Chief Economist at the CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, Aled Iorwerth. Aled, you've talked about some of these other issues. You've talked about NIMBYism. You've talked about low productivity. You've talked about the lack of innovation. How are we going to solve these issues in the housing sector?
These are really, really difficult issues, and they're going to take time to solve. And it's going to take everybody working together, all orders of government, everybody. And I am not sure how it's going to be done, but these are some of the challenges. And these challenges are becoming more prevalent across Canada. So you brought up the issue of NIMBYism, for example, and I was interviewed recently about what's going on in St. John's, Newfoundland about NIMBYism. Well, if you have a problem on NIMBYism building housing in St. John's, Newfoundland, I mean, this is a challenge. It's not a Toronto specific issue. If it's coming up in Newfoundland, I mean, it's pervasive, and we're facing a structural shortage of housing across the country. So I think how are we going to solve it? It's going to involve a very concentrated effort, um, which is going to be challenging and really prioritizing the construction of new housing. And how exactly in practice we do that, like the politics is probably going to be quite difficult.
So I've had some people tell me that the only solution is have a top-down kind of approach that makes as of right zoning for increased density, increased height possible. And the example being, if you leave it up to the local councillors in a specific ward, they're always going to have the pressures of the local constituents, the local ratepayers organizations, that don't want change, that don't want that increased traffic, that increased density, and they're the ones that vote, and so therefore it gets increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for the local councillor to support development, even though they know that if they oppose it and it gets appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal, it's probably going to get approved. But all it does is delay things for 2 years and $1 million worth of legal and other consulting expense. And so therefore, by definition, it effectively makes housing more unaffordable. And so therefore, the solution would be, this major transit station area proposal that was talked about but never implemented, that said that we would increase density if you were within a certain distance from a major transit zone. And it would appear that the ministerial zoning orders that the Ford government put in place along the Ontario line were effectively doing that. They were increasing the zoning, but was on a one-off basis rather than a blanket increase in zoning around major transit areas. I had this example given to me of a street in Mississauga where almost everyone went to the Committee of Adjustment for a deck, and the comment made, well, if everyone's going to get a deck approved, why don't we just approve decks and make it a blanket change in the official plan and say the zoning allows you to build a deck of a certain size so that not every single person has to go to the Committee of Adjustment. So is one of the solutions that we just need to have either citywide changes or province-wide changes that give us the right to build what clearly developers want to build and what people want to buy.
So the short answer is yes, but it probably needs to be even more comprehensive than that, because there's a risk that, okay, well, you allow something over here, but then you do something else over there to try and counteract what you allowed in the first place. So there's a lot of stories these days, for example, about development fees going through the roof. So there's a challenge now. Well, suppose that you allowed everything as a right. Okay, fine, but don't raise development fees in order to prevent the building taking place. So there just needs to be a very, very clear goal, I think, to build more housing, and people need to be measured on that output, that outcome of building more housing. I'm not always sure that sort of for the federal government need to be intricately involved in saying what sort of policies need to be involved. What we need are more housing. How you get there, it's not necessarily an issue for the federal government. But so yes, I agree with as of right, but then we need to keep development fees in check as well. So the goal has to be more housing supply. And whatever means municipalities want to choose to get there, that's fine. But we need to keep our eyes focused on an end goal of more housing supply.
Okay, so let me ask you about development fees then. So, development fees have gone up by, some people are saying, several thousand%
Yeah.
from something along the lines of $1,500 per house to almost $100,000 per house. And just in the last year, up by 30-40% in seven municipalities. A couple of municipalities have reduced development fees, and one political party is arguing for a massive reduction, if not elimination, of development fees. Who pays development fees? There's been this argument that development fees are paid by rich developers, and we might as well get them to pay. And then other people argue, no, development fees are passed on to the consumer, and so therefore consumers pay development fees. And then the argument about, well, growth should pay for growth. And so that makes logical sense that, if you've got new housing, you should have that new housing pay for the growth. And then other people say, no, it's for things that are of a community-wide benefit. And so therefore really should be paid out of general tax revenue. So tell me, sir, what's an economist think of development fees? Who pays for them? And should they be paid by the one new building or by society in general?
Well, first, the flippant response is that if you have growth paying for growth, then you will get less growth. I mean, it's just prices up, growth goes down. Secondly, there's a lot of economic research. Unfortunately, most of it is in the US, but it's fairly clear that it is not the rich developers that pay development fees. Yes, they hand over the cash, but the end result after all of this is that new home buyers pay more for housing. This is fairly clear from the research. So um, there is the question that then comes up is what are those development fees paying for. If there is, I don't know, putting a sewer into drainage into your house, okay, maybe that's defensible to be part of the development fee. But the risk is that all sorts of other community benefits are being jammed into these development fees. And clearly, a lot of those should be paid out of property taxes, out of other forms of taxes, and not development fees. The more interesting case, or the example that I think is illuminating is in Quebec, which is the traditional approach in Quebec. Quebec had an interest in increasing the size of the population. If you want to increase the size of the population, you need more housing. If you want more housing, the province needed to make housing cheaper to build, and therefore the province would step in with a lot of these infrastructure costs, sewage, roads, whatever. So a lot of those costs were paid for by the province, and development fees in Quebec used to be extremely low, and it made housing relatively more affordable. Now, yes, there's a trade-off. You may have higher sales taxes, higher income taxes in Quebec, but housing was cheaper. So I think the economics in this area is relatively clear that these development fees lead to less housing starts, and when they are charged, they are going forward to new home buyers. And then there's a risk, as I said, of these development fees not being proportionate to the actual infrastructure that a house needs. So I think there are a lot of questions in this area, and a lot more transparency would be helpful.
Part of the problem that municipalities got, and I think that they should be able to deal with it, but is that if they don't get the development fees, then they've got to by extension increase property taxes, which means that their electorate's not going to be very happy with that. And so that their issue is, do they tax the people that are currently here and voting, or do they tax the people that aren't even here and don't have a
No,
vote yet?
no, I completely agree. I mean, the politics of this is extremely difficult, and that's why at some point the province and the federal governments are going to have to come up with some funding, and in exchange for funding, and this is the Quebec model, in exchange for funding, not have development fees. I think ultimately that's where we have to go. There will be funding from higher levels of government, but then with strings attached.
So it's not just the development fees. I'm told that the price of new homes are 31% taxes and development fees. So it's HST, it's other land transfer taxes, it's a whole bunch of other taxes that get embedded in the price of new homes. And we don't have a 31% tax on any other product that's delivered to the market, do we?
No. So I think the whole structure of taxation, there's also, you may correct me here, but in Toronto, there's been a long-standing issue that the rental buildings tend to have proportionately higher taxes than owner-occupied housing. Proportionately, high-rise buildings tend to have higher taxes than low-rise buildings. And so there's a lot of stuff in here that doesn't seem to make sense when you're trying to really increase housing supply over the long term.
You came out with an interesting article that said, I think a lot of people would think housing that's unaffordable is just bad. But you said it actually negatively impacts our economy because people don't move. We don't have labor mobility. Can you explain it to me, sir?
Sure, it stems from the fact that we observe population growth has been significantly less in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, relative to Calgary and Edmonton. So the usual approach is more population means more pressure on the housing system, and therefore house prices go up. But when you look at what's happening in Alberta, where they've had more population growth, they have relatively more affordability, it shows that that argument is not 100% correct. So Alberta has managed to cope with population growth, and it has kept housing relatively affordable in Calgary and Edmonton. Whereas in Toronto and Vancouver, house prices have gone up and population growth has been lower. And so the obvious conclusion, given the where house prices are in those two cities, is that house prices are deterring people from moving to Toronto. It's discouraging young people from staying in Toronto. So If they want to leave the family home in their 20s, finding a new place to live is going to be extremely difficult. So they might as well leave Toronto and go to Calgary, where they have at least some chance of getting a house, renting, or buying a home. So we're not saying that house prices are determining everything about where people live, but I think people are more and more aware of how housing costs are affecting them, and it is leading to people choosing where to live based on housing costs. They're not going to stay in Vancouver and Toronto. And that has longer term implications. So Toronto is increasingly built on a knowledge economy, on getting people with skills to live and work in Toronto. And with high house prices, that pool of workers, that pool of labor is going to be smaller. My suspicion is that Toronto is already the businesses at universities, hospitals in Toronto are having a hard time attracting people from the rest of Canada and the rest of the world because of high housing costs, and this is damaging Toronto's long-term growth prospects.
Damaging Toronto's long-term growth prospects because of how high housing prices are. But Calgary, Edmonton have got a lot of land around them.
Yeah.
Is it just land, or is it zoning, or is it development fees, or what?
It just seems a lot easier to build in Alberta. Now they are sprawling, and that has its own set of issues. They need to build a lot of roads, and there may be some environmental consequences. But the approval rates seem a lot faster in Edmonton in particular. So they have less regulation. The people in Alberta complain about the level of regulation, but it's nothing compared to Toronto and Vancouver, according to our statistics. So development fees are lower. They have uh, it just seems a lot easier to build there. And building what people want to buy in Toronto, Vancouver, it takes years.
So in Calgary and Edmonton, they've got some condos, but you're saying it's sprawl, so it's single family homes, and you're
Yeah.
saying that people, are buying what they want to buy. Is the problem that we're not making land available in the Greater Toronto Area for single family homes that we've been so anti-sprawl? This is politically controversial, but was the Greenbelt therefore a good decision or a bad decision?
The latest research I've seen suggests the green belt per se was not the issue. I think the whole challenge is in redeveloping what is already there. So driving around Toronto, there seem to be a lot of industrial spaces, a lot of low-rise buildings. Um, this may come as a shock to Torontonians, but I don't think of Toronto as being a particularly dense city. So I think Toronto just needs to make it a lot easier to add density, to make rezoning a lot easier. At the moment, it seems to take years and years to rezone property. Um, so if they want to keep the green belt, fine, but the whole process of densification needs to be made a lot easier, and that goes back again to regulation and encouraging through whatever means, you know, development fees that are relatively low for apartments relative to single detached or whatever, but the densification needs to be made a lot easier.
We're chatting with the Deputy Chief Economist at the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation tonight about the housing crisis in the Greater Toronto Area, across Canada, frankly, housing prices, but also housing supply. We're going to take a break for some messages and get back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm chatting tonight with Ed Iorwerth, the Deputy Chief Economist at the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, about housing and the housing crisis, housing prices, housing supply, etc. Aled, I got to ask you, two of the other things that you've been talking about in some of your articles and posts have been productivity and the lack of innovation. And you've been really saying that I think that the housing industry is somewhat at fault because the housing industry hasn't been very innovative, hasn't been very productive.
Yes, and there is a bit of a chicken and egg situation here. The development industry, the builders, they are responding to the incentives put on them by various levels of government. And if they don't get a lot of incentive to innovate, then they probably won't. Now, it's a little bit of a concern in the back of my head that if by some miracle the regulatory burden was removed overnight, would the development industry, the building industry, would they actually be able to respond and just build massive amounts of new housing? And it's a bit tentative, but we're a little bit skeptical that the industry can ramp up very quickly in that regard. The productivity, which we can think of, say, as the number of housing per worker in construction, seems to be very weak worldwide. There was a very influential paper produced in the US by two highly respected academics, and I forget their precise title, but it was something like the pathetic growth of productivity in US construction. So seems to be a global phenomenon that the construction industry does not change very rapidly. Now, as I said, they may not have the incentive to change, but still, there seems to be a structural problem here. Um, we suspect that, for example, that there are too many small firms. You don't have, yes, you may have companies like Elliston that can have economies of scale, but it seems to be a very mom and pop industry. They don't seem to have structural increases in productivity over time. And so this may be a challenge. If What we would hope is that as you know, we're putting more emphasis on housing supply, the building industry itself would start to automate more, digitize more, and get more housing built per worker. But at the moment, we're not sure that that capacity exists. Now, this also then leads into other areas like what is the potential for modular housing, manufactured homes. There's a lot of people talking about it, but can this be actually implemented at scale? And then that again goes back to the regulatory structure because some of the regulations on these manufactured homes seem to differ from municipality to municipality. And if they differ to that extent, then again, you don't get those economies of scale. The whole idea of manufactured homes, or whatever the right term is that you can produce homes in a factory-like setting, produce them at scale, mass production, lowest cost. And we're not quite there on that as yet.
So I've had the criticism made to me that it is the regulatory impediments that are the challenge, and it's building codes that are very different by province. It is municipal codes that are different that you've talked about. It's things that are requiring setbacks that are different that don't make economic sense. Fire exits that are 50 years out of date. Fire codes, local fire departments that get involved and end up being problematic. The number of different departments that need to comment on any kind of development that takes place that is far more onerous than you would get in any other segment of society. How do you feel about that criticism?
I think that's fair. I mean, so another type of manufactured home, which is quite specific, it's called an accessory dwelling unit, like a granny flat, whatever the term is. The whole unit can be built off site and then moved to your back garden, basically, and it's an extra dwelling unit. But then I hear stories of all sorts of regulatory differences on these, where you located, how far from the house, and the reg like the whole point of these type of units is to have mass production at scale, and you drive down costs by repeat. And at the moment, having all of these different regulatory structures differing by house, it just negates all of the potential of this sort of technology.
So, Aled, CMHC came out with a report a little while ago that said that we needed, I think it was 1.8 million additional homes over and top of what was being going to be built anyway within the next 10 years. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any kind of return to housing affordability. The provincial government came out and said that we needed 1.5 million homes by 2030. Um, we're not close to meeting either of those targets. And in fact, everything has gotten worse. So, what's the implication of that?
Well, I don't, this is not meant to be flippant. It's a sad truth that we are going to be facing a lack of affordability for a very long time. If you don't build the housing, house prices go up. We are having affordability challenges, and this is a challenge for young people. It's a challenge for people who want to live in Toronto, Vancouver, and now other cities. So you mentioned there are the Ontario numbers, but this is now becoming an issue in Quebec and Nova Scotia. The only place that seems reasonable at the moment are in the prairies. So unfortunately, this means we're going to have more affordability challenges, and it is in fact going to be a generational challenge.
A generational challenge. So the other side of it is that a lack of affordability means a lot of people that look more like me than my kids are going to end up having sizable increases in their net worth because their housing is worth more. And if you and CMHC are able to get housing more affordable and bring housing prices down, aren't there a lot of people that are later on in their life with million or more of net worth embedded in their house that are going to lose money, going to lose value? Isn't that one of the risks of making housing more affordable? Is that people are going to lose money?
Well, I think the one dimension, and it's what I was hinting at in my previous answer, is that this is going to take time. If we build more housing, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be a step change in house prices. It's going to take years and years to do this. It's more a question of bending the curve on affordability rather than an overnight change. So my hope is that with credible policies to increase housing supply, people will start to realize that housing is not a place to store money over the long term, and so they will start to diversify their holdings, their savings away from housing, put some of those single detached housing on sale, and try and get them redeveloped into denser housing. So this is what I when I say it's a generational challenge, it's going to take many, many years to address this, and hopefully this is going to give time for people to adjust and not have all of their retirement savings in housing.
I also think one of the things that we've got to, inform people of is that if they've got an overvalued home and they sell it, but they're buying another overvalued home, they haven't really made any money. And similarly, if their house value goes down by 20%, but then they sell it and they buy another house that has gone down in value by 20%, they haven't really lost money either. So
Yeah,
it's
no,
like
I
paper money.
yeah, I completely agree. The situation that we haven't really looked at very closely yet, but we need to get into is what is going to happen when we have all the baby boomers moving, trying to downsize at the same time. So they will be at some point moving from their single detached housing into more apartments, senior living, whatever. So at some point there may be a little bit more of an exodus out of this housing, but we that's a problem for that's not the problem we're facing right now, but it is there on the horizon.
So sounds like actually that would be a benefit. And I've had someone say that one of the challenges with development fees being so high is that property taxes are so low. With property taxes so low, it doesn't create the incentive for people to actually want to realize on the sale of their home. It's sort of an incentive to stay in your
Yeah.
home longer than you otherwise would. And that if we actually rebalance things and had the appropriate level of property taxes, which would be higher than they are today, and development fees, which would be lower than they are today, uh, it would um, it would create an incentive for people to sell their house that used to have five people that only has two in it now, and downsize and move somewhere because their opportunity to move is too expensive. Their opportunity to stay is too inexpensive.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's not just a financial issue. I think at some point it's going to become a health issue. So there are a lot of policies at the moment of aging in place. And from personal experience, I'm not really sure that it's appropriate for the elderly to be in single detached housing with stairs. So I think there are clashes between various types of policies, and I think at some point we're going to have to discuss how getting the elderly to move out of their single detached housing into um, denser housing in their community So, they're in their house, they probably go to church locally, they need to be in their community. They have their friends there, the services there, so they need to be in the community. But if the whole community is zoned for single detached, there's not going to be anywhere for them to move to. So they stay in place. And again, this locks into health policies that I'm not convinced about personally, but they clash with the need to redevelop some of these housing as well to have denser housing. So I think there are a lot of areas in the future that we need to discuss in this area that could free up more housing for more development.
Aled, we've talked about development fees too high, sales taxes too high, property taxes too low. We've talked about zoning too restrictive, building requirements changing by municipalities. We've talked about a whole bunch of things that government has put in the way of more affordable housing. Are rich developers the problem, or is government the problem?
At the moment, I would say that developers are operating within a policy framework designed by governments. Design may be a too strong a word. A system that's been put in place by government. So, if developers are making too much money, the probable reason for that is that there's not enough supply. If you have a lot of developers coming in, if there's competition, um, profits go away. That's standard economics. So I think to a certain extent, it's the policy framework put in place by government. There are other areas where it depends how you define developers. So the system of ownership of land in Canada seems to be quite vague. I don't really understand, or I don't have any data on how concentrated ownership of land is. So I suspect that a lot of landowners are making money. That's not necessarily the same as developers making money.
We're chatting with the Deputy Chief Economist at the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation about the housing crisis, lack of affordability, but also, the impact of a condo crash, and it seems to be almost two countervailing issues right now. Maybe one is the solution to the other. I don't know. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Aled Iorwerth, the Deputy Chief Economist at the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, about the housing situation in Canada today, focused obviously primarily on the Greater Toronto Area. And housing has got to be one of the topics that people talk about more than anything else. And Aled, I wonder if I could challenge you for a second in that I think and I worry things are going to get worse. You talked about Trump. I think most people think that Trump is going to put some tariffs in, even if they're not the 25% that he initially talked about, that is going to have a negative economic impact, that might lead to a recession. Some people say that we're in a per capita recession in Canada already, and that the only reason why we're not in an actual recession is because we've had population increases. The Canadian government is going to go the opposite direction, or at least going to try to, from a population standpoint. So we're going to have less population, less GDP, probably a recession. If you have tariff increases, a recession, job losses, and a condo crash all at the same time, and 80 projects in the Greater Toronto Area put on hold. So challenges in regards to jobs for construction workers, and I'm told that excavators are looking for business today, which is sort of the leading indicator of where construction activity is going to go. Isn't everything we're talking about going to get worse? That the bust is going to get even more busty, low, and that might lead to an even bigger problem, as you say, a couple of years from now. Isn't everything you're worried about going to get worse? And isn't that terrible?
I agree. There's a lot of negative news out there now. The one silver lining is that this may lead to change. Sometimes it takes a crisis in order to get the policy framework right. So we've been worried about housing affordability now in Toronto and Vancouver for close on a decade. We've been consistently pointing out the need for more housing supply. There have been actions taken by the provincial government, but I think we need now a more unified, everybody, all hands on deck, everybody working together to increase housing supply, changing the policy framework, changing a lot of the rules, changing the fees, changing the taxes, and maybe with this sort of well, yeah, I'll use the term this crisis. Maybe now is the time where we really get shovels in the ground. If there is unemployment as a result of a global recession, a US recession, then this is the time to get those workers employed in building more housing. The potential is there, the need is there, and we need to respond to that.
I agree. I think, who was it that coined the phrase "never waste a good crisis"? I think we need to do that. I worry that if we don't, all these construction workers that are going to be out of work are going to either leave the province and or going to leave the sector, and then we're going to be desperately in need of them in 2 years' time when supply goes down dramatically. And I think that we do have an opportunity to rebalance our housing situation, make it more affordable, but we've got to change things. And I think two municipalities recently have reduced development fees. I think we need to have it province-wide. I think we need to have the province step in and replace those development fees that the municipalities are not going to have. I had somebody come on my show and say 50% of something is a heck of a lot better than 100% of nothing, and I think that's true. I think that property taxes are a problem. We have to make sure that the electorate realizes that we've been part of the problem. NIMBYism is a problem, and I think we need to realize that we've been part of the problem. I do think as of right zoning, particularly around major transit areas, but also in the redevelopment of densification of streets. You see the one-off sale of a bungalow to a developer that's going to then build a monster home. Well, maybe it should be a duplex or something else. And I do think that there is some land around Toronto. I'm not suggesting for a nanosecond that we should get rid of the Greenbelt, but I do think that there is land around Toronto that should be built and should be allowed to be built for single-family homes. There's infrastructure there. There's servicing made available. They should be built, and we should not be robbing the next generation of the dream of a single-family home that so many of us have had the opportunity to live in. And I do think that this is an intergenerational inequity where baby boomers have benefited from cheap housing, abundant jobs, a positive economy. And if we don't make changes, they're going to give inaffordable homes, um, lack of homes, huge amounts of debt, huge taxation onto the next generation. And that's just not fair. And we need to make some changes. And maybe, Aled, you're right that this is the crisis that we need to have to wake all us up so we take action and we support the governments that are going to take the action. Aled, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I'll remind you I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. I do these long form interviews where I really try to get into the depths of a discussion with some pretty intelligent, capable, articulate guests just like Aled. Thanks for joining. Good night, everybody.